She was 27 years old when she walked down an aisle meant for someone else, wearing a gown that had been fitted to her twin sister's narrower frame and carrying a bouquet of white ranunculus she had not chosen. Her name was Alara, not Bella, and the cathedral was in Seattle, not Boston, where the November rain streaked the stained glass in shades of emerald and sapphire, and the pews held 400 guests who believed they were witnessing the union of two powerful families. The dress was Monique Luliliere ivory silk with a bodice of hand-stitched lace that dug into her ribs with every breath. Her sister Celeste was thinner. Always had been the kind of thin that came from Pilates and intermittent fasting, and a lifetime of being told she was beautiful enough to get away with anything. Alara had her grandmother's hips and her mother's soft jaw, and a heart that had spent 27 years being told she was the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who cleaned up messes she did not make. And here she was, cleaning up the biggest mess of all. The groom stood at the altar like he already owned the room and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. His name was Gideon Cross. 36 years old, self-made billionaire founder of Cross Industries, a tech investment firm that had swallowed 3 competitors in the past 18 months. The financial press called him the ghost because he moved through markets without leaving footprints until it was too late. He wore a Tom Ford tuxedo with the kind of ease that suggested he had been born in it, and his eyes were the color of the Puget Sound on a stormy morning gray with depths that promised danger. When Alara reached the altar and his gaze swept her face, she felt something crack open in her chest. Not attraction, not yet. Recognition. Like he could see the seams where she had stitched herself into her sister's life. "You are taller than I remember," he murmured, as the organ faded and the officiant began to speak. Heels Alara managed. His hand closed around hers, and his thumb found her pulse point with surgical precision. She felt her heartbeat betray her, hammering against his touch like a confession she could not control. Something flickered in his expression. Not a smile. The ghost of a question he was not yet ready to ask. The ceremony blurred. Vows were exchanged, a ring was slid onto her finger, and when the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," Gideon cupped her face with one hand and leaned in slowly. His lips hovered a breath from hers, and she caught the scent of him, sandalwood and black tea, and something cold like winter air through an open window. Just a contract, he breathed against her mouth. Then he kissed her. Brief, controlled, devastating. And when he pulled back, his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her forget for one terrifying second that she was wearing someone else's name. The reception was held at the Four Seasons, a blur of champagne and congratulations and strangers calling her Celeste with warm smiles that felt like accusations. By the time the black Rolls-Royce delivered them to the penthouse atop Cross Tower in downtown Seattle, Alara was running on adrenaline and the desperate hope that she could survive 6 months of this performance. The penthouse was all glass and steel and cold marble, a space designed by someone who valued control over comfort. Gideon shrugged off his jacket and walked to a bar cart, pouring himself 2 fingers of scotch. He did not offer her one. "Sit down," he said. She sat on the edge of a gray leather sofa, still in the wedding gown, the ring heavy on her finger. He set a leather portfolio on the marble coffee table and flipped it open. "Clause 1, he began. "Duration, 6 months. Clause 2, public appearances, minimum 4 per week. Clause 3, separate bedrooms, separate lives. Clause 7, no emotional entanglement." Alara looked up from the document. "You wrote a clause against feelings. I wrote a clause against complications." He settled into the chair across from her, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "Same thing." She held his gaze even as her pulse hammered. "Maybe you are just afraid of both." Something shifted behind his expression. Not anger. something closer to interest. "You are not what I expected," he said carefully. Alara's stomach tightened. The interviews. Celeste had done 5 rounds of vetting with Gideon's legal team. Alara had a folder of notes and 3 days of frantic preparation. "Maybe your expectations were wrong," she said. He studied her for a long moment. The city lights glittered beyond the floor to ceiling windows, and the silence stretched thin and taut between them. "Sign the last page," he said finally. She took the pen. Their fingers touched during the exchange. Brief, electric, impossible to ignore. She signed Celeste Ashford in ink that felt like a lie burning through the paper. Gideon closed the portfolio without looking at the signature. "Your room is down the hall on the left." He paused at the entrance to the hallway and turned back. "One more thing." "What?" His eyes held hers across the room, and she saw something flicker there, something she could not name. "You do not act like her." Then he was gone, and Alara sat alone in the darkening penthouse with the ghost of his words pressing against her chest like a warning. The first month passed in a careful choreography of public appearances and private distance. Gideon was polite, professional, and utterly impenetrable. He escorted her to charity galas and corporate dinners with a hand on her lower back that felt both possessive and performative. He introduced her as my wife with the same tone he might use to announce a quarterly earnings report. And every night he retreated to his study while Alara lay in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to remember who she was supposed to be. But there were cracks. Small moments when the mask slipped. Like the night she found him in the kitchen at 2 a.m. reading a worn paperback copy of The Great Gatsby. "You read?" she asked, surprised. He looked up, and for a moment, he seemed almost human. "You thought I only consumed financial statements." "I thought you only consumed scotch." A pause. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile, but close. "I read to remember," he said quietly. "Remember what?" "That there is a world outside spreadsheets and acquisitions." He closed the book and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Something unguarded. "My grandmother gave me this copy when I was 15. She said every ruthless man needs one thing that makes him soft." Alara leaned against the counter. "And what makes you soft?" He held her gaze for a long moment. "I am still trying to figure that out." The next morning, she found a copy of her favorite novel, To the Lighthouse on the Kitchen Island, with a note in his sharp handwriting. "Thought you might need something to read." He had noticed she was a reader. He had noticed. The hospital called on a Tuesday morning in late October. Gideon's grandmother, Cora Cross, had been admitted to the cardiac unit at Swedish Medical Center after a sudden episode. Alara heard his voice through the wall, low, urgent, stripped of its usual command. When he emerged, his face was carved from something she recognized. Fear. "I am going to the hospital," he said. "I am coming with you." "That is not necessary." "She thinks I am your wife, Gideon. If I do not show up, she will worry more." He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a single tight nod. Cora Cross was 82 years old with silver hair and bright dark eyes that missed nothing. She had been a journalist for 40 years, and she read people the way she had once read headlines, with precision and skepticism, and an unshakable instinct for the truth. She took Alara's hand with surprising strength and studied her face in the pale hospital light. "You have kind eyes," she said softly. "I told Gideon that is what matters most. Not the degrees, not the family name. The eyes." She glanced at her grandson. "She is lovelier than her photographs." Gideon's expression did not change, but Alara saw his fingers tighten around his grandmother's hand. They stayed for 3 hours. Cora told stories about Gideon as a boy, how he had built a miniature stock exchange out of index cards and charged his cousin's commission on every trade, how he had read the Wall Street Journal at 12 and brought her hand-picked dahlias every Sunday until he left for Stanford. Alara found herself leaning in, not performing, not pretending, but genuinely wanting to know. When they finally left, the afternoon had turned gray, and a cluster of photographers swarmed the hospital entrance. Gideon's hand found her back instantly, pulling her close, positioning his body between her and the cameras. "Do not look at them," he said, his mouth close to her hair. "Eyes on me." She looked up. His face was inches away, his jaw tight, his eyes burning. For a fraction of a second, his gaze dropped to her lips. Then the car door opened and the moment shattered. Inside the car, the silence was different. Heavier. Loaded with something neither of them was ready to name. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For coming. For being there." She turned to look at him. His grip on the steering wheel had relaxed, but his eyes stayed on the road. "She really likes you." "I like her too." A pause. Then barely audible. "That is what scares me." The business trip to Vancouver was supposed to be routine. Gideon had meetings with a biotech firm on the verge of acquisition, and Alara accompanied him because the CEO's wife had specifically requested Mrs. Cross join the private dinner. Appearances were non-negotiable. They checked into the Rosewood Hotel under a sky heavy with impending rain. The concierge hesitated, typed something, hesitated again. "I am terribly sorry, Mr. Cross. There appears to have been an error. We have you listed for 1 suite rather than 2. Gideon's jaw tightened. The suite had a king bed and a sofa. It was the best they could offer. "I will take the sofa," Alara said. "You have meetings at 7. You need actual sleep." He looked at her, and something passed between them. "Fine," he said. The dinner went smoothly. Alara charmed the CEO's wife, and Gideon closed the preliminary terms with a handshake that left the other man visibly unsettled. They were good together in public. Too good. Back in the suite, the storm had arrived. Thunder rolled across the harbor, and rain hammered the windows like it wanted in. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Alara heard Gideon's voice in the darkness. "Are you all right?" "I am fine." She heard him move closer, felt the warmth of his presence before her eyes adjusted enough to see his silhouette against the lightning-lit windows. "The storm is getting worse," he said. "I noticed." They stood in the dark, listening to the rain and the thunder and their own breathing. "Gideon," she said. His hand found hers in the darkness. His fingers intertwined with hers, slowly, deliberately. "I need to tell you something," he said. His voice was rough, low, stripped of its usual armor. "I know you are not Celeste." The words landed like a physical blow. Alara's lungs emptied. "I have known for weeks." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "My security team found the second file. Twin sister, Seattle address, former elementary school art teacher. You gave up your classroom to step into a life that was not yours because your sister disappeared and your mother needed medical care you could not afford." Tears burned behind her eyes. "Gideon." I did not say anything, because by the time I had the proof, it did not matter anymore. He stepped closer, and his other hand came up to cup, her face, his palm warm against her cheek. "You were not a mystery to solve. You were the answer." Lightning split the sky, and in the flash, she saw his face clearly. Open, undefended, his eyes glistening with a vulnerability she had never seen. I have never felt this awake, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not once. Not before you. She reached up and pressed her hand against his chest, feeling the violent rhythm of his heart. Say my name, she whispered. Alara. Not Celeste. Alara. Her name, spoken deliberately, weighted with intention, tasting each syllable, as if learning it for the first time. I want to say your name correctly every morning, he said. I want that to be the first thing I do. She kissed him then. Or he kissed her. Neither could tell where one ended and the other began. His hand slid into her hair, and her fingers fisted in his shirt, and they stumbled backward until her spine met the wall. The storm raged outside, but inside the dark suite, there was only the sound of their breathing and the soft, desperate collision of two people who had finally stopped pretending. They lay tangled in the sheets as dawn painted the harbor in shades of rose and gold. Alara's head rested on his chest, and his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said, we tell Cora the truth. And then we figure out the rest. Together. The truth surfaced on a Sunday in December over Cora's dining table. It was nobody's fault. Cora was telling a story about Gideon's mother when she turned to Alara and said, Margaret would have adored you. She always said Gideon needed someone who could see past the armor. Then she paused, tilted her head, and added with devastating casualness. Of course she was imagining a daughter-in-law named Celeste. But names are just sounds, are they not, dear? What matters is the heart that answers to them. The table went still. Cora Alara breathed. The old woman reached across the table and took her hand. I have watched you for months. You are not the woman I met before the wedding. Your gestures are different. Your warmth is different. You hold his hand like it means something. She squeezed Alara's fingers. I do not need the details. What I know is that my grandson has come alive since you walked into his life. And I am not foolish enough to question the gift when it is this extraordinary. Alara looked at Gideon, expecting the mask to return. Instead, she found him watching her with an expression she had never seen before. Open, undefended, his eyes bright. I knew, he said quietly. I have known for weeks. And I did not say anything because it did not change what I felt. He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. You were chosen, Alara. From the moment you walked down that aisle in a dress that did not fit with a name that was not yours and looked at me like I was worth the risk. You were chosen. Cora lifted her water glass with trembling fingers. To the woman who was brave enough to stand in someone else's place, and extraordinary enough to make it her own. They drank in silence. And somewhere in the space between a grandmother's blessing and a man's unguarded heart, two people who had begun as strangers bound by paper discovered what Cora had known all along. The contract was false. The love was not. Sometimes the most honest thing in the world begins with a lie brave enough to reveal the truth. 1 year later, Alara stood in the greenhouse Cora had built behind her Queen Anne home, surrounded by dahlias in every shade of gold and coral and deep velvet red. Gideon appeared at the entrance, his sleeves rolled up dirt on his hands from helping Cora with the planting. When he saw her, his entire face transformed. There you are, he said. Here I am. He crossed to her and pulled her close, his hands settling on her waist. I was thinking, she said. About what? About how close I came to never walking into your life. About how one decision, one desperate, reckless decision, changed everything. He pressed his forehead to hers. You saved me, Alara. From a life of spreadsheets and silence. From becoming the ghost, the newspapers called me. You made me soft. She smiled against his lips. Someone had to. He kissed her slow and deep and full of promise. And in the greenhouse filled with flowers that Cora had taught him to grow, two people who had found each other through a lie stood in the quiet truth of what they had built together. Not a contract. Not a performance. Just a choice. Made every single day. She walked into his life wearing someone else's name, carrying a secret that could have destroyed everything. But the heart recognizes what the mind refuses to see. Gideon did not fall in love with a contract. He fell in love with the truth hiding beneath it. And Alara discovered that being chosen is far more powerful than being perfect. Some love stories are written in careful script on expensive paper, signed and sealed and bound by clauses. And some love stories begin with a lie brave enough to become the truth. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and become a member for early access to upcoming stories. Your support makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing narratives that move the soul.